So, John, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm going to do a quick gallop through some notes I have here, and then I think the more interesting bit will come when Peter and Fiona and I, and no doubt John, will be in conversation. Just before I start, a little bit of housekeeping. I know this is done quite often, but could you just all check that your phones are switched on? You may need to tweet while I'm talking, or you may need to do your email or check your Facebook or whatever else. So please make sure they're all switched on. Right, so what am I going to talk about? Tonight, this afternoon, I just thought I would correct the record. There have been so many books about Fairfax, where I worked for a glorious 5 years, but I thought I would actually correct the record. It's about time that somebody said something honest about what really went on. Just kidding. Just kidding. I'm not going to talk about Fairfax. I'm going to leave it for others to do it. Instead, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the conversation. And in a sense, that I'm going to start almost at the end and then work backwards. I went to Boston to meet somebody called Professor Tom Patterson. Tom is the Bradley Professor of Media and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I was told by a number of people he'd written a very important book. This is it here. And in the book, he talks about the need for a new kind of journalism, which he calls knowledge-based journalism. The reason that he wanted to do this is the whole book, and it's a fascinating book for anybody who would like to read it, chronicles the decline of the media, but more importantly of journalism in the US. He's extremely damning about the media, and he claims that the misinformation that the media pervades in the US has led to poor public discussions, the corrupting of public information, and a lot of misinformation. The combined effect, he says, is to have left the public battered and powerless to make rational decisions. He finishes by saying that the real issue facing America now is there isn't even agreement on the facts any longer in the US. And arguments, he says, of course, can have no foundation if we can't even agree on the basics to which to build. And he finishes by saying, for society to have a meaningful and constructive conversation, we need to trust information. Now, he told me all about this, his arguments, and then at the end of it I said, well, can I show you, Tom, something about the conversation? So we spoke about it, and at the end of it he said, you know what? This is exactly the kind of thing I'd hoped would emerge at some stage. And I didn't know what to call the conversation's new form of journalism. He gave it the name, and the name that I now use is knowledge-based journalism. So, by going to Harvard, I learned a new term for what we do. Although the place is called the Kennedy School, it's not JFK journalism, it's KBJ journalism. So that's, in a sense, what we call what we do. So, what I'd now like to do is to explain to you how I got to seeing Tom Patterson and coming up with this idea. As John kindly mentioned, I edited a range of papers in the UK, both in London and in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And then in 2004, Mark Scott, who now runs the ABC, invited me to become editor of The Age. One of the things that I've had is a ringside seat, which I think is pretty privileged for any journalist to have. Not as an editor, where you just edit, but actually within what I call the killing rooms, which are known as the boardrooms, of some of the biggest papers that exist. So in London, I sat in on Guardian newspaper's board as the editor. In Glasgow, I sat in on the Scottish Media Group's board. In Edinburgh, I sat in on the Scotsman newspapers board. And here, I didn't sit on the board of Fairfax, but I sat on what was called the executive committee of Fairfax. So as an editor, you get to actually see the real decision making that goes on within these boardrooms. And at each one of these, this is spanning a time during which I was actually able to sit in at that high level, which goes from around about 1994 onwards. At each one of those, there was a similar refrain, and it always started with a financial director going through how bad the numbers were. And by that, I mean the performance of the company. And by the way, for any of you who wonder what newspapers really are, they are fundamentally, at the very heart, advertising companies. That's what they are. And they sell advertising, but to sell advertising, they need to draw readers in, eyeballs in, which they then can sell to advertisers. So, at every meeting, we would start off with saying classifieds are down. Classifieds means cars, homes, property, jobs, and so on and so forth. Classifieds are down, red. Display is down, red. Circulation is down, red. So it was down, down, down as the Coles jingle goes. But at the same time, costs were going up. So if you wanted to keep your job at any of these places, and I'm talking not as an editor, but I'm talking as a manager, your job was to take out costs faster than revenues were falling. So what you had to do was go through your line of costs. And these are the kind of things that we had to do. Now, some of these look silly, but every one of these is the kind of discussions that we used to have in our boardrooms. Right down to, look at this, shutting the switchboards down, shutting the canteens down. Just cut everything out, take out costs, just to stay in the game. And the result, of course, of all this, once you do all this, is the product is inferior. You hollow out your newsroom. You take out some of your best people. And at Fairfax, which is now largely run by a consultancy company called Bain & Co., because the management have outsourced the management to an outside company. It's not funny, it's really serious stuff. What they've said there at Bain & Co. is actually, maybe you should just bring in trainees to start doing some of these jobs, because trainees will be even cheaper than your journalists. But guess what? The readers can actually spot what's going on. They can see that the service is inferior. They can see it's thinner. They can see there's less depth to the reporting. And guess what these smart people do? Just when they've got rid of a lot of their best assets, they've kept one who's here, but a lot of their best assets have gone, they then put up a wall around what's left. It's called a paywall. And they say, if you want access to it, we'll charge you. Well, guess what? People say, sorry, the horse has bolted. So even that model doesn't work because they haven't thought it through. Anyway, look, that's my deep background about what happened. That's the story of Fairfax in 2 minutes, as it were. I don't want to spend any more time on that. I left in 2009, and I got a call very soon after leaving from Glyn Davis, the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Melbourne. Now, if you're the editor of a paper in Melbourne or here in Sydney, the one thing you get to know is the civic leaders, and one of those key civic leaders, particularly in Melbourne, is the Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne. And he and I have become friends in much the same way as I count you as a friend, John, really just through discussing mutual areas of interest. He's a political scientist. Curiously enough, he was here at the University of Sydney, where he did political science, and then he became a cadet at the Sydney Morning Herald, and didn't enjoy that and went back into academia. So he and I both have an interest in the idea of good quality, credible information. So he said to me, what are you going to do next? And the one thing I didn't want to do was to write a book about what went wrong at Fairfax. You've seen there's lots of other books out there. That's, to me, not constructive use of my energy. What I wanted really to do was to see, is there another way of creating the kind of valuable stuff which I went into journalism to do, which is high quality information. Reliable, credible, something that forms, I think, the basis of democratic debate and of an informed citizenry. So Glyn said to me, I'll give you a desk and you spend a bit of time thinking here at the university. But he gave me probably the best tip of all. He said, there are 10 people I suggest you talk to. And these 10 people were some of his leading thinkers at the university, which included a whole range of people from people on the sciences, earth sciences, astronomy, social sciences, government, the legal affairs department, right across the board. He gave me 10 people to go and talk to. And those 10 discussions were probably amongst the best discussions I'd had as a journalist in most of my career. Because here were people who were truly smart. Here were people who'd spent a career thinking about their area. And here were people whose job fundamentally was to try and understand problems and come up with solutions to those problems. Each one of them, as I say, had conducted research and inquiry into their area. But here was the problem. They felt, largely speaking, that the knowledge they had as public-spirited individuals was not being able to get out there and actually better inform the wider public. What they actually felt was that they needed to get out of there. They wanted to share that information with the public. They wanted, in many ways, to think of recasting the university as a brains trust, as a public think tank, as a solver of society's big problems. So, the problem was, though, to get their information out, they had to go through a process which is called getting through to the media via gatekeepers, because that's the biggest way that you can get through to the largest number of people. The problem with the gatekeepers in the media was that a lot of them were actually more interested in science or stories which would be weird, which would be, as it were, sexy. And those were the kind of stories that, for example, would say, we want stories around cures to breast cancer, but anything down below is a bit mucky and we'd rather not have that. That's the kind of stories that you get to know and understand what we'll get through. The other thing is that when they did agree to do an interview with a journalist, quite often that journalist would not really have done any desk research or any research around the subject. They just walk in and start asking questions, write down some notes, and then sometimes misunderstand what was actually being told to them. Go back to their desk and mash it up into a version of what that person said. You've got to remember, for some of these people who've spent a whole career working on a subject, they really want the integrity of that information going out in a way in which it isn't lost, isn't twisted, isn't distorted, but remains true to the research which they put a lot of thought into. So, and I'll give you an example. Peter Doherty, Nobel laureate, his area is viruses, flu viruses. Every time there's a new outbreak of a virus, he'd be rung up by a journalist who'd say, tell me, Peter, should we be worried about this new virus? And he would say something like, and I paraphrase, look, if you're over the age of 10 or 12 and over the age of about 65, you could have a problem. But between those ages, you'll be fine. There's enough herd immunity or whatever else. Next day, he'd pick up the paper and it would say, Nobel laureate says this flu is not to be worried about. He would get a call the next morning from the chief medical officer saying, Peter, why have you said that? That's not the information I'm giving. And he said, it's not what I said. So he decided, as with these other 10 that I spoke to fundamentally withdraw from the public arena and withdraw back into the safety of, as it were, the walled garden, or the phrase John hates, the ivory tower. So, to me, I thought this was massive public failure on a huge scale. This was not working. Something had to change. There has to be a better way of doing it. And here I come to the birth of the idea of the conversation, because Peter Doherty said to me, Andrew, have you ever thought of doing things in a different way? Why don't you use your skills as an editor, and believe it or not, we do still have some skills as part of our training, excuse me, part of our training. And I will use my skills, this is Peter Doherty, in terms of my knowledge of my subject. So I'm a subject matter specialist, you're a journalist, let's get together and let's see if there's a different way of producing information to get out into the public arena. So I took that thought away, I went back to the desk, worked on it for a couple of weeks, worked out the logistics of doing it, worked out a budget to do it, and took it back to Glyn Davis and said, there is a new way of doing public engagement in terms of bringing your researchers and academics into the public arena. So he said, well, good idea, but I can't afford it. Because what we're talking about is hiring a lot of editors, journalists to work with his people. So he said, okay, well, rather than just do it with Melbourne University, why don't you throw the net wider? And we then brought in Ed Byrne at Monash, we brought in, I won't go through all the names, but we brought in a whole bunch of other vice-chancellors who said that they would help with this. So with that, we were able to get some seed funding, we were able to build a model, and we fundamentally built something which would allow us to connect, as I said to you before, the academics and researchers to the public through a new direct channel. So no longer were we going to ask permission for the kinds of stories that we wanted to get out there. These were joint decisions arrived at by academics and researchers and journalists together, working out what was the important stuff to get out. Now, John asked me why we called it The Conversation. John's alluded to the fact that I actually have a background in music, and I've been involved in newspapers and launching magazines and all sorts. So coming up with a name is terribly important. And the one thing I didn't want to do here was to have a name that included all the kind of places I'd worked for in the past. Names like The Age, The Herald, The Guardian, The Bugle, all those kind of names. There's lots of them. The Times. Those were legacy media titles. The second thing I didn't want to do is come up with a title that sounded like an academic journal. Because, again, there's nothing wrong with academic journals, but they're read by very few people and they all sit largely behind paywalls. That's not what we wanted. What I wanted was something that spoke of collaboration, of a free flow of information, of better informed public discussions, and a word that suited the informality of the age that we are in now, the age of email and Facebook, etc. Now, the English political thinker Michael Oakeshott, talking about the word The Conversation, he said, properly speaking, a conversation is impossible in the absence of a diversity of voices. Bingo, that sums up exactly what we wanted to do. This is not a voice, it is conversations, it's lots of voices. Then we had to decide how to set up the conversation as an entity. I worked at the Scott Trust and I was very impressed with the way that The Guardian and The Observer, which I edited, were run by a trust whose role was to make sure that these publications would exist in perpetuity as not-for-profit organizations engaged in high-quality dissemination of information. The ownership structure of the Scott Trust was exactly what I mimicked when we set up the conversation. We call it the Conversation Media Trust, very similar to The Guardian's. It means that we're a not-for-profit entity. It means that I despite the fact coming out with an idea, will never earn anything from it. I have no shares. Nobody has any shares in our organisation, but we do something much more valuable. And as a journalist, to me, this is probably the most important job I've done, with maybe the exception of the work I did at The Big Issue, which again was important for different reasons. We now have a virtual newsroom of 50 editors spanning the UK through to Australia. And in our virtual newsroom, we have 13,000 contributors. But each one of those contributors is a specialist. You cannot write for the conversation unless you can demonstrate that you are a deep subject matter expert in your area. So think of that, think of the newsrooms I used to inhabit, think of what was happening there. We now have 13,000 specialists and 50 editors. Quite a different model. And we've got just a very simple aim with everything we do. Our job is to try to make sense of the world, to try and explain complexity, to try and correct misinformation. We have a fact-checking service which is peerless, in my view, very different to any of the other fact-checking organizations because everything is peer-reviewed. Excuse the pun. And fundamentally, we're just committed to one thing, which is getting that good information out to as many people as possible without commercial or ideological gain. We don't aim to break news, by the way, because news is a commodity. You can pick it up anywhere, on Twitter and anywhere. That's just a given now. What we're interested in is the much more valuable stuff, which is making sense of the news. We publish every day around about 50 stories, all under something called Creative Commons. And for those who don't know what Creative Commons, it fundamentally means that your copyright is waived as long as you use the copy as per the way it's been published. So you can't change it. It's called no derivatives. As long as you keep it as it is, the copy is free for you to use. We also do explainers. We do a lot of explaining journalism, just explaining very basics. What is Ebola, for example? Some of this has been collected in a book we did with Ciro. This is just a collection of all our explainers, as it says, from deja vu to why the sky is blue. Very basic stuff. Because a lot of us go through life not really fully understanding issues. And that's our job, is to explain. But as I said, we're different because of that Creative Commons element. We don't just publish, we disseminate. So we publish stuff on our site, but anybody is free to use it. And currently, we've had over 12,000 sites globally taking our content and republishing it. Now, there's probably more newspapers, but we don't know, we can't actually track that. If anybody takes our content, it's got a little counter in it that tells us who's taken it and also how many people have read it. So the current sites in Australia, you'll know a lot of them who take it, ABC, Fairfax, News Corp, West Australian, AAP, through to sites like Mumbrella, Mamamia, Business Spectator, and then across the world, sites like Scientific American, Nature, BBC, The Guardian, Huffington Post, Jakarta Globe, New Statesman, Washington Post, etc. Washington Post have just started using a lot of our content. And there's a site who some of you may know, which has just gone off virally. It's called I Fucking Love Science, or IFL we call it. They take a lot of our stuff. So what we do is we attract to our site, roughly about 1.6 million come direct to the conversation site. But every month we're recording around about 6 million people reading our content on other people's sites. So the key thing we've done is changed the relationship of a publisher where people put a wall around it and anything you read, for example, Peter's on the Sydney Morning Herald is copyrighted, it's owned by Fairfax. You can take it, but you have to go through syndication, you have to ask for permission, and you would have to pay. We've got rid of that. The reason being, we believe in open access and the free flow of information to every part of not just Australia, but to the world. Quite often people say, okay, so how are you different to others? Here's a quick checklist for you. The key thing is, as I said, we don't have a paywall, we don't carry advertising, we don't have banner ads, we don't have pop-ups. And as you can see from here, not only are we free from the commercial agenda, we also very much want to be solution-centric. So instead of telling people all the time the bad news, why things have gone wrong, and we do that as well, by the way, but we don't stop there. We actually try and do what every good researcher and academic does, is not just to understand the problem, but to offer solutions to those problems. That's the tough bit, by the way. Just going through the entrails of why something's gone wrong. My view is there's a skill in that, but it's a limited skill. The solutions, which is what all our authors focus on, is to me the really interesting stuff. We also don't carry something which some of you won't have heard of. It's the new magic, the new black magic in the media. It's called native advertising. How many of you have heard the term native advertising? So what is native advertising? What it is people thought, okay, rather than placing ads in newspapers or on websites, why don't we hire some of those journalists that have been laid off, because they have great skills as storytellers, and what we'll do is we'll give them a product to sell, but instead of doing it the old way, which is placing an ad, we'll actually get them to tell stories about our product. And then we'll weave those stories into the media in such a way that nobody will even notice it's advertising anymore. But guess what? If we get them into the media, we'll get lots of eyeballs reading, and people will think they're credible because they actually appear within the editorial columns of some of these outlets. And guess what? The Guardian is doing it. The New York Times is doing it. They're weaving these kind of stories in, and this is, to me, extremely worrying, because you no longer can differentiate between what is advertising and what is editorial. So that blurring of the edges is the beauty of the new native advertising model from their point of view, because people are paying lots of money to get into this new area. That has to be watched, and that's something we will never accept. Going back to what we do, I put at the end here, new voices. Of all our authors, and in Australia it's 10,000, in the UK we have 3,000, and it's growing very fast. 40% have been followed up by the media. So that's 4,000 new voices participating in public and civic discourse. And that's great, because what we're about is challenging the current concentration and lack of diversity of views in this country by actually pushing back into the community lots of new voices. So that's 4,000 new specialists, new voices, trusted voices, who can, as I said earlier, help society, guide society in terms of its understanding its problems and coming up with solutions. But you know, the beauty of the current age, which is an age of a digital age, is the ability to check things. Anything can be checked these days, and I love that. You can throw a light into lots of dark corners. And of course, my worry is going back to native advertising. There are certain problems with that because you don't really know the provenance of that content. To me, what's terribly important is no longer to assert the word trust, and I hate the word trust. I never use the word trusted journalism. But what you can do is you can try and rebuild a bond between yourself and your readers. And to me, you can't assert that anymore. You can't just say, we are a paper of trusted whatever. You have to actually demonstrate to your readers what you've done to earn their trust. What we do is we've introduced very strict codes of conduct. These codes of conduct go to every one of our journalists, they go to every one of our authors, and it's all about, it starts off with disclosure. So every single author here has to say what they know, what's their expertise, what relevant expertise. You can't write outside your area of research. We need to also know about the funding. Who's paying for your research? We're bound by a very strict editorial charter, which is on our website. We have an editorial board which is made up of very senior academics. Here at Sydney University, Duncan Iveson, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, is on our board. It's mainly DVCRs and deans who have an oversight over the way we conduct ourselves. And those, by the way, codes of conduct reflect similar codes of conduct within the university and research world. And as you'll know, they're pretty strict there as well. And the final thing we do is, once we've edited a copy, to avoid that problem that goes on in every newsroom, and Peter, you know this as well as I do, the biggest problem that goes wrong is the headline. Because somebody's written a headline which was, as it were, a sexy headline, which is to stop and attract the reader to say, don't flick past this article, read me. So it pushes it as far as it can, and quite often it crosses a line when people say the headline was wrong. And that's usually where the problem comes up. So what we do is, before we release the story, because we do write the headlines, we do edit the copy, we do add in links, we do add in pictures, we do captions, all of that, we send it all back to the author and say, please check this, because at the end of the day, you need to take ownership of this. We want you to be entirely happy with it. So that's the reason for the author sign-off. And by the way, and again, sorry to bring you into this, Peter, but I think any good journalist worth their salt would always want to check the copy before it's published to make sure that it's been edited in a way that still keeps the argument true and the headline reflects the story. So fundamentally, we care about getting things right. We check every edit, not just one editor, 2 editors checks it. And as I say, this process can be lengthy, it can be somewhat arduous, and it means we are not as fast as some organisations might be. But here's the thing, in a race to be first and to get it right, we will always go for the latter. Always go for the latter. Yet we turn things around very quickly. We get stories up within 2 hours of being commissioned. Why? Because the specialist subject matter author starts off not having to then go back to their desk, Google in the subject, do some desktop research, ring around, get a couple of quotes, write the story, and then whack it out. Here, you go to the person who actually knows their subject matter, and by the way, every one of our authors usually has a global network in whichever field it's in. They know the best people throughout the world in, for example, earthquakes or whatever it is. They know who to talk to. And they have that information at their fingertips. And they can actually write, as I say, within 2 hours that we might commission somebody, it's up. Which is why we publish 50 stories a day. So, just to finish on this last bit, what we're trying to do is to reassert the primacy of getting public information right. That, to us, is the most important thing, because after all, we think that's the basic currency of civic society. In terms of how we've grown our audience, we haven't spent a penny on Above the Line. Not a single penny. Everything has been achieved through social media, but more importantly, through people referring to our content. So when a reader finds the stuff that we do, they tell their friends, they tell their peer group, they tell their networks, and that's the way we've grown. And it's just spread like wildfire. A number of people say, okay, so who actually reads your content? So the reason I put this up is people think, is it just academics? Now, this survey was done just over 2.5 years in. 80% are non-academic. The number of academics in this country is finite. It's about 70,000 in Australia. As we grow our audience, and by the way, we've doubled every year. The first year, we're averaging every month 350,000. The second year, we did 600,000. The third year, we did about 1.4, and we're now tracking nearly 2 million. We're not quite doubling now, but you can still see the trajectory. And as we get more of a general audience, the number of non-academics will, I think, increase to 80, 90, 95. But look who they are. They're young, gender neutral, reasonably affluent, and obviously educated. So who are these people? So the biggest chunk still is the academics and people in research, but here's the other big areas. Government and policy, for those of you who can't read at the top. education, training, healthcare, media, technology, information, arts, design, administration, so on and so forth. So quite a widespread, but people fundamentally are coming to this site not for sport, because we don't really do sport, we don't do showbiz, we don't do gossip, we don't do all that kind of stuff. No Justin Bieber stories, but what we do is serious stuff, and that's why these people are coming to us. So we've actually done something else, which is, and I want to touch on, before I come to this slide, how we're funded. We are fundamentally funded not by the old business model of advertising, but by a new model in which our partners, the universities and CSIRO, fund about 60% of everything we do. We then have another batch which is corporates, so we have very large corporates like the Commonwealth Bank, our largest single corporate, but we also have support from a range of others. And we have donations. We're running at something like $250,000 a year in people just sending money because they like what we do. And lastly, we have the Department of Education, who fund us directly, who also fund the universities. Now, the Department of Education puts in roughly $15 billion a year into higher education research. About $11 billion goes into universities, $3 billion goes into the ARC to fund research, and about just over $1 billion on CSIRO. So $15 billion is put into content making, if you will, which means paying for the research that goes on, the research, the thinking, the expertise within the sector. We unlock some of that, translate it, and push it back out for $1 million, which is how much we get from the Department of Education. As I say, I'm very transparent, just so everybody knows who our funders are. Now, why is what we do important to universities? Well, both in Australia and in the UK, where we started, there is now a new requirement by public funders, which means largely government, which is we will give you the money, but we need to understand what you're doing with the money in 3 particular areas. We need to know, 1, you're doing very good teaching, and there are ways of measuring that. 2, we need to know you're doing good research. But 3, we need to know that you're sharing your knowledge, which the taxpayer, the public, has paid for, back to the public. So what we give now every single university, and it starts with every author, is a dashboard. That dashboard tells you in real time how many people have read your story, how many people have commented on your story, how many people Facebook liked it, tweeted it, and so on and so forth. All that in real time, plus which countries they're from, and finally, which publications are republishing your stories as well. All that's captured, huge amount of data. You won't know how many people have read your stories online. We give every single author a dashboard. We then aggregate that by institution, and we come up with this, which is our new league table. So Melbourne University has had a reach of nearly 7 million people of its content. And by the way, of that 7 million, about 1 million is in the US, about 500,000 in the UK, and so on and so forth. And so it goes for all of these. And this is terribly important to the Department of Education, who have access to these metrics. As one of our key stakeholders, they check constantly how is each university performing. I mentioned to you each individual author has a dashboard. This is a story, it's a fantastic story. The headline speaks for itself. It just basically says, no, not everybody has got a right to an opinion. And of course, the number of comments, by the way, was enormous on this. So look at the number of tweets, 5,000. 22,000 likes on Facebook. And picked up, and of course people like Richard Dawkins, Ricky Gervais and others, Brian Cox, have all tweeted out saying you should read this story. So this gives now an author, and this is a philosopher by the way, a lecturer in philosophy. Patrick Stokes used to write largely just for academic journals, where he might get a couple of 100 people reading it at most. He now gets 1.2 million. So we've completely changed the ability for creators of knowledge, thinkers, to disseminate their knowledge and share their knowledge with a wider public. I'm just going to wrap up now by saying that not only have we challenged the myth that academics can't write, that they're loopy, that they live in this sort of ivory tower where they can't talk, they can't communicate, they can't help. I think we have started on a process of actually demonstrating that these are the trusted knowledge carriers that can help guide society in the ways I've indicated. And in many ways, what I see us as doing is a democratization of that knowledge. That's all it is. We're translating it into plain English. And by the way, we have a fantastic new way of doing it, which is to use an algorithm, which is called the Flesch-Kincaid, which we've developed, so that when you write, it actually is set at the reading age of a 16-year-old, and it allows every one of our authors to be able to simplify their language to be understood by the widest number of people. We translate it, and then we make it freely available on an open access site. So what next for the conversation? We have, as I said to you, a virtual newsroom. This is some of our editors. We've got, as I say, 14 in London. There's a total team there of about 18. We've got 32 here in Australia. And these editors work together as one virtual newsroom in each of the desks. So we have a science desk, a health desk, and so on and so forth. Each one of them focuses on content that's relevant to their own territory. In other words, stories relevant to the UK or relevant to Australia. But we also cross on stories that we think will be of general interest, or which are of general interest, where we can actually get the best research and thinking on all of those. So Ebola, we work together on the MH17, we work together on the Commonwealth Games. But these are the kind of areas we want to get into, which is focusing on the big problems facing the world and coming up with solutions. Doing this is quite unlike any other kind of journalism to date, because most of the journalism you get works like this, where you might, I've just chosen New York, where you have editors in New York who would send their staff out into the field, called correspondents, and they would then pick up stories that they think would be of interest not only to their editors, but to the readers of, say, the New York Times or whatever. So there's a self-selection of stories, a self-selecting agenda of what gets out. And if you have lived in America, you will know that the newspapers there are quite insular. So if they're to cover foreign stories, they've got to be of some interest to readers of those papers, which means a lot of it is left out. So I've jumped a couple there. So a lot of their work is defined by geography, whereas we do it the other way around. What we've done is we've got currently 13,000 academics, and this is growing. I don't know why that's doing that. I think the guy wants to get his picture up there as soon as possible. What we do is we have 13,000 people here who are pushing their stories up to our editors. So it's a fundamentally different way of doing journalism. And what's even more important here is that this distributed model, as I call it, means that we don't have the view from New York or the view from London or the view from Sydney. The idea here is we do a flat form of journalism where we find out what's going on in every part of the world, from developing nations to developed, from north to south, to rich to poor. It isn't the Davos view of the world, it's more the Delhi view of the world. And that's a new form of, I think, equitable creation of content, which is quite different to what you'll see in the traditional Western-dominated media, largely Anglo-Saxon values. So, into all of this, we have a pretty good new model, but it faces some enormous challenges. The biggest challenge of all is how are we going to fund this? Because we have a different funding model. How are we going to make sure that we retain standards when we start moving into new territories? How are we going to make sure we work together? How are we going to police the site in terms of not only our ethics, but our comments and how people behave? These are all new areas which we're exploring. But I can tell you something, it's pretty exciting stuff to look at. And finally, the man who wanted to be up there, Malcolm. He wrote this, he didn't write this, he gave a talk at the Lowy Institute last week in which he said, the Australian media rarely reports what's going on in other countries and how they tackle similar problems in different areas. I met him and told him about what we do. He didn't really understand what we did. And I think he's now, hopefully, got a better formed view of what the conversation does. The final thing is, John, the slide and the lecture this evening was about the future of journalism. And I want to be quite clear about the conversation model. I don't want you to, in any way I should say, feel I've delivered the conversation as the solution. It is not the solution. The conversation is a solution. It's a different approach towards doing things. And you know what's very exciting right now is that instead of people talking about the withering of the media, there's actually a new flowering of the media. So we now have The Guardian in Australia. We have The New Daily in Australia. We have Mail Online, whether you like it or not. And in the US, we have ProPublica, we have Vox, we have Quartz, we have Nate Silver's 538, and so on. There are going to be many new players in this space. And that's really what excites me, because in this connected, complex, and competitive world that we all live in, there are some new players coming through, new voices. And the other thing is that because we now live in this 21st century digital world, there is an ability to rethink how we do journalism. And again, I'm not suggesting we've come up with the answers, but we've gone some way towards marking out a new territory, a new standard of conduct, a new standard of journalism, which I think is appropriate to our age. So I hope you see that what we've tried to do is flesh out a new model. We've tried to introduce new voices, and we hopefully have done that in such a way that there will be a free flow of this information, not just from Australia, but throughout the new areas that we're moving into, to bring Australians a view of the world, to bring other countries the ability to share in the kind of platform that we've built. So thank you very much for listening, and now we'll get on to the really interesting bit, which is the end of me talking alone and Fiona and Peter taking the show and livening up the evening, and then we can all go to the pub and do the real discussions. John, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Fiona.
Yes. Now, do I have to adjust my accoutrement? Yeah.
Where do you want us to?
Yeah.
So really you come up here.
I might sit myself down. You may want to shuffle at this point, because I think these benches were made in an age when pedagogy was more interested in punishment than it is now. Andrew, it's been a delight to see the conversation grow and mature over the last 4 years, and I've been really excited by being a contributor and being back in journalism, even when I'm arguing with your editors about what actually is accurate quality information, what just happened on the occasion. But I think the really surprising thing about what you've done with this venture is that you've gone against the accepted wisdom. I saw that Jay Rosen was saying the other day that if you are going to start from zero with journalism, what you need to do is, to succeed, is to be a niche news site with a very narrowly defined community. And people know Rosen probably. If you don't, he's an eminent New York academic, media studies academic, and he's a leading thinker on pro-am collaborations. You've done exactly the opposite of what he said. You've gone after a generalist model. Features and commentary site that serves many interests. It's more like the defunct National Times than it is Eric Beecher's Women's Gender or the Mandarin. So in that sense, I think we can really say it is a new form of public service media, and certainly of civic journalism if you count for the problem-solving aspect. because it has that universal appeal. Now, of course, some uncharitable folk might say that, well, of course, the conversation's expanding when everyone else is contracting because you're leveraging government funding. So it's the public purse that's propping up the enterprise. And it's the same conversation that's had about the ABC and SBS. But I think it's wrong in the respect that you elaborated, that you're value adding to the research investment. And that's what's going to be quite exciting when you do the research on what sort of multiplier effect you're having with the conversation. I think also in terms of people's careers, what effect does it have for an academic to publish on the conversation? Can we actually measure what happens? The other thing that's important that I think is really exciting is the Creative Commons licensing. 87% of articles get republished somewhere else, and you gave other impressive figures. Now, I'm not sure if every republisher is actually following the terms of the licence. I bet you most of them don't read it. But that said, the iterative effect is stellar. And I think that's where we can really see Australian research investment getting a greater international impact. So that's exciting. Whatever the future holds financially, I think after the Abbott government takes its magic to the Senate, I really hope that the conversation holds its university sponsorship. It does a public communications exercise and a journalistic collaboration with academics that I haven't seen before. And certainly community radio, which I started in trying to do this sort of endeavour. I still think there's a lot of work for you to do, though, in escaping old media models and old media thinking. Being critical and analytic, but not holding to the production models that Peter's used to and I was used to. And I'll offer 3 suggestions there for the future. And the first is that your editors don't fall back on the pressure to get stuff up quickly, to react to the media agenda. And it happens occasionally, and we've all seen it, that those of you who read the conversation will occasionally see articles that I don't think you probably celebrate in the same way that we celebrated that particular example that you gave us. The conversation should champion what Mitchell Stevens calls wisdom journalism, and you gave it a different title, that knowledge-based journalism, but all journalism draws on knowledge. I think the idea of wisdom-based journalism, specialist, reflective and analytical, revelations not announcements, is really important and shouldn't get confused, as you said, with the news agenda, because I think politicians may, and certainly the general public may on occasion, confuse what the conversation does with the sort of news and current affairs journalism that we see is under threat at the moment. But the conversation is an example of media diversity. It's not a substitute for local news, for the Sydney Morning Herald, and it's certainly not an argument for the withdrawal of funds from the ABC or SBS. It's not a one or the other argument, as you say. The more information society has to take in, to evaluate, to analyse, the more we need journalism skills. So, while the conversation is an extraordinary contribution, it still worries me that news journalism is in crisis. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to, because there is this argument that the internet will provide us everything, and you're part of that world. It's not true. The conversation can't monitor the estates. It can't monitor corruption in business in the way that Peter's colleagues do. And the final suggestion that I had, and my real hope for the conversation, is that it starts to teach contributors and users how to have a conversation online. I've been tracking comments on the conversation stories on the UK and the Australian site for the last 2 months, and I've found that your sites average 19 comments per story. That compares to 60 per story for the Sydney Morning Herald, 173 for the Daily Mail, although I'm not sure about the quality or accuracy of any of those,
and 283 on the Washington Post. That's average comments. Now, I know there are a lot of differences in the model, and we can argue about the differences in approach to comments and the length and so on and so forth. But I think still that there's probably less response to the articles and maybe less discussion happening on your side. So one of the things that Andrew and I talked about before this forum was that we really want to do some research on how to better foster, to facilitate and respond to comments. And hopefully that's something we can turn our attentions to. Because that would make the conversation a leader in public debate, and it would live up to its name in a pragmatic way, rather than just in a figurative sense. Oh, that's about it.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Fiona.
Peter.
Peter, someone from the less loopy sectors of society.
John, will you let me come back to some of those points? Please.
I may. Let's hear what Peter has to say. Peter.
Well, the first thing is I'm not going to disagree with anything that anybody has said about the collapse of Fairfax or the great newspaper companies, because
It hasn't collapsed
it's
yet.
true. No, it hasn't collapsed yet. It's well, we'll come back to that. But it's also true, as you said, Andrew, that Fairfax has been busy getting rid of any of the journalists with expertise, standing, credibility. Now, I'm still left there, so I'll let you draw your own conclusions and maybe challenge some of the kind things that these very nice people said out of courtesy in their introduction. It's been a terrifying half hour, 40 minutes for me, because we've heard concepts like knowledge-based journalism, wisdom, even higher hurdle for a working soil journalist to jump, a world where headlines reflect the content. These are revolutionary ideas. And as you say, I don't know how many people may be reading something I've written. I've always written everything on the basis of zero. And it's terrifying to think that maybe, there is a way of checking and maybe it's more than one. And finally, the concept of, a media site, Andrew, that isn't interested in gossip or celebrities. The Sydney Morning Herald website would be basically empty if we applied that rule rigorously. You call it up, it's mainly full of a bunch of old junk. Today, every day, I find myself shaking my head as I survey the latest offerings. Today there was a pride of place given to a story about the more fun alternative to exercise regimens, sexercise.
Oh, I saw it.
Did you read it?
No, I did read it. I saw it.
Okay. Then it didn't work. He didn't click on it. He must be far too serious a fellow.
Need to get out more.
What is the? I'd like to pose this very fundamental question. Andrew touched on it. What is the definition of news? News is something that goes wrong, something that went wrong today, yesterday, or is about to go wrong tomorrow. That's news. 10,000 cars can drive down your street today and nobody will remark on it. As soon as there's a pile-up, everybody will talk about it. News is basically, with some exceptions, some of the celebrity gossip. I mean, Justin Bieber. What would a website be without Justin Bieber?
Or Timberlake.
Or Timberlake. So news is broadly what goes wrong. And we've applied this to our analysis and conversation about, in my case, our own industry. We have, in general, 97% of our time and energy has gone into talking about what is going wrong with our industry, with our companies, with our newspapers, with our websites. And it's been pretty distressing to be on the inside of it, and it's no wonder everybody talks about it. I've seen hundreds of my colleagues shoved out the door in the last 10 years. Hundreds. Some of them came and went before I even knew who they were. Others have been long-standing, cherished colleagues out the door as a cost-saving measure. So it has been distressing, and the focus on it is understandable because it's what's going wrong. But today, we hear from Andrew one of the things, a great example of what's going right. When I started in this business as a cadet at the Sydney Morning Herald, actually, in 1982, what Australians heard about the world, what Australians learned about news, was in the hands of 3 families plus the ABC. If the Packer family, the Murdoch family, the Fairfax family didn't want you to know a fact, an event, they didn't think it was important, they thought you should be protected from it, they were protecting somebody, plus the ABC. So it's 4 sets of hands. You didn't hear about it. You didn't know it. It never happened. Now, is this really the golden age, the halcyon era, that we want to recover, that we want to preserve, that we want to recreate? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That was a terrible state of affairs, and the big media families did sometimes collaborate.
Change the microphone.
Sorry?
Can you change the microphone?
Oh.
You don't need it.
Okay, all right, sure. The big media families, the clans, did collaborate sometimes, especially about their own interests, about what you should hear, what you should learn, and what you shouldn't. That was a terrible way to inform a democracy and a public, as Andrew's told us. You used the Michael Oakeshott definition, that to have a well-informed citizenry, you need diversity. Diversity is the fundamental good in creating an informed citizenry. Well, in that case, this isn't a bad news story. This is, as John said at the outset, a joyous event about a joyous phase. I mean, okay, it's been tough for companies like Fairfax. It's been tough for some of the old news and newspaper companies. But let's change the focus here. Let's turn the telescope around and look at it from the citizen point of view. Now, you not only have the old media companies, they're still there. The ABC is still there. Packer's gotten out of the media, but Fairfax and Murdoch are still there. And they're still making money. They still have consultants running around with juvenile ideas for cutting costs. And they're still implementing them. But Fairfax last week reported $250 million net profit. Revenue was down for the company as a whole, sure. It was down by 3% over the year. But it was still making just under $2 billion in revenue for the year. This is an institution that's not about to die. Likewise, in the last quarterly results announced by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, he split the asset, but now all the newspapers and publishing are contained in a separate company. That company reported its results. Revenue was down 5%, going in the wrong direction, but it was still making just over $2 billion in revenue for the quarter. These institutions are not going to die. They're making lots of mistakes. Sometimes I despair over management decisions taken at my own employer, at Fairfax. I only stay sane by looking outward at the world rather than inward at my own employer. But they're still there. In addition to that, we now have a whole range of other voices, outlets and sources that just didn't exist. A decade or a decade and a half ago, there was no conversation. There was no Sky News. Sky News started with 6 journalists. Now it's got 300. Sky News now has more journalists than we do. The ABC now has News 24. There are new websites all over the place. The Conversation is one, and you ran through a few of the others that have sprung up as well. Some are purely local, like Crikey. You touch on Eric Beecher. Eric Beecher's company, Private Media, rolls out a new website-based service, new masthead every year or two. Then you have, there are magazines that didn't exist a decade ago. On the right, there's The Spectator. On the left, there's The Monthly. And which reminds me, the publisher of the monthly, Maury Schwartz and Black Ink Publishing in Melbourne, also publishes the quarterly essay. You know, an intelligent, informed, expert commentary every quarter on a current issue didn't exist. We've got many more choices.
Saturday paper.
And they publish the Saturday paper as well, plus a suite of books. So we have many more options, many more opportunities, many more sources. And I say, thank God for that. And at the speech that Malcolm Turnbull gave at the Lowy Institute that Andrew mentioned and quoted from a minute ago, he made the point that, you know, Malcolm Turnbull said our local media is very insular, and reporting of overseas events was always, you know, contained, maybe 20% of the newspaper, and now it's even less. In his speech, Malcolm cites a senior journalist, but doesn't name the journalist. The journalist is me. I told him this. I said, you know, I remember 20 years ago, the Herald always had at least one foreign story on the front page. It was a formula. At least one story about something going on outside Australia on the front page. Now the paper goes for weeks, sometimes months, without anything on the front page happening outside Australia. Now, there's a logical reason for this. It's not because Australians have become more insular. It's because there's this thing called the internet. And instead of reading what some Australian journalist has rewritten from the Washington Post, you can go to the Washington Post website, read it yourself, and be one of the 239 commenters, if you want. And by the way, I admire your pluck in researching comments on the end of newspaper website stories. You know, there's that old adage that any argument that goes on long enough will end up with one participant comparing the other to Adolf Hitler.
Godwin's law.
Godwin's law, thank you. Well, I think the comments that they publish at the bottom of newspaper articles bear that out. I think that's a perfect illustration of
There's an algorithm
the
for
quality.
that.
Yeah. So my basic point is to say that if we look at this from the point of view of the citizen, the point of view of the polity, this is a much better world, a much better media world than the one I started out working in 1982. And if that's the basic equity we're trying to protect and develop here, democracy, this is a great development. Lindsay Tanner, the former Labor finance minister, wrote a book shortly after he retired from politics, all about the failings of the media. And it's a great book, and if you haven't read it, I'd recommend it. It's called Sideshow. His basic thesis is that, these are my words, not his, but his basic thesis is that the media is like some sort of circus with a ringmaster holding up a flaming hoop, and the politicians, to get attention, will do anything that the media wants, and they'll jump through the flaming hoop as and when the media wants, or do any other trick that the media demands. And he's absolutely right. And he chronicles in his book all the failings of the media, the gotcha journalism, the distortions, you name it, the trivializations, everything. The only thing he doesn't mention in the book is the formative event in politics in Australia in the time he was in government. The pivotal event after the election of the Rudd government was when the Rudd government broke its promise to introduce an emissions trading scheme to address climate change. When that event happened, the government's polled support collapsed, and the Labor Party panicked and brought down their own Prime Minister. Everything else in Australian politics followed from that day. My point is that everything that Lindsay wrote is true without really being relevant. Because at the end of the day, the Australian public saw through all the nonsense. The Australian public was able to see through all the gotcha journalism, the distortions, the lies, the vendetta journalism, the trivialisation, the gossip, and the Justin Bieber stories, and was able to filter all that out and identified the critical event and acted accordingly. Now, what's happened in the media in the last decade and a half, has done a tremendous amount to arm and equip the citizenry with the tools to compare, to contrast news, information and analysis to get a better informed citizenry. So that all the criticisms that Lindsay Tanner makes will continue, no doubt, to be true, but let's hope they will be even less relevant. And I'm going to leave it there.
I just want to make two quick comments.
Can you be very quick, because otherwise we'll have no conversation with the audience.
A couple of things. Peter, thank you for that. It was terrific. I just want to pick up on two things. The first one is, you said, what is news? You've got to be quite clear about what is news, what we do and what we don't do. So my view is a lot of what comes out of universities actually is news. It's breakthroughs, it's new inventions, new discoveries. To us, that's news. The sad thing is we cannot and will not, and we don't have the resources to do what Fiona talked about, which is investigative journalism, which is called shoe leather journalism in old days, which means you get out from behind your desk and you actually go and you see contacts, you dig, and you find out stuff that people want to desperately keep out of the public arena. And what the Sydney Morning Herald has done here with the New South Wales politicians and others is exemplary work, which our academics and researchers will never do. The bad news is, how is that going to be funded into the future? Because most of these media commercial organisations, as I said, are interested in selling advertising, which means clicks, which means clickbaits, which means if it bleeds, it leads. If it's sexy, if it's weird, that's the kind of stuff that will get people clicking on it. Investigative journalism is not the kind of stuff they want to put out there because it actually is not read by that many people. The people who do read it, by the way, are hugely important. But the question is, how are we going to protect that into the future? The work, as I said, of Nick McKenzie and Richard Baker at the Melbourne Age, and as I said, down here, that's the really important stuff which we can't do, and we've got to find a new way to fund that. In the US, it's done by something called ProPublica, and if any of you look at it, they do some of that kind of stuff. The other quick point I just want to make is that do be careful, Fiona, when you're looking at clicks and comments and all this. If you take The Guardian had, before it even started in Australia, 1 million unique viewers a month to its site, and people went to it largely to read English Premier League soccer, football. That was the reason they went to it, not for anything else. And so when they've come in, they've introduced new stuff, but that's the number one reason. The second reason was its coverage of the arts, largely music and film. That's why people went to it. The Daily Mail, it has large numbers, but it's because people go to it for nonsense. And the same thing goes with BuzzFeed, etc. They're all read for different reasons. And also the audiences of the Washington Post are going to be much larger than anything you'll ever get, here in Australia. So you've got to be really careful about comparing like for like in this area, because we opt out of the popular stuff, the clickbait, the popular culture, the showbiz, the gossip, the sport. We just don't do that. So it's horses for courses. If you strip out what we do and compare us against, say, the Sydney Morning Herald in terms of the serious stuff it does, you probably find that our readerships are not that dissimilar. But as I say, I just want to leave that last thought, John, which is the important stuff is the investigative stuff that we don't do, and it's how we fund that into the future that worries me most.
Peter would like 30 seconds, and then I promise, we'll come to the audience.
Specifically on that point about the future of investigative journalism, how is it going to be funded? Well, the profits of the actual hard copy newspapers in the last financial year at Fairfax were up by 40%, to $140 million, which was a little more than half the total group profit. So despite the best efforts of the management to kill off the newspapers, they're actually solidly profitable. The investigative journalists that Andrew specifically talked about, you've named two of them in Melbourne, Baker and McKenzie. You've referred to the work of Kate McClymont on ICAC in Sydney. These are journalists who have been told not to apply for redundancy and they're not going to be let go. And the funding base is there. So at least in the short run, we don't need to panic about that. The larger issue is a real one, And we have to hope that serious investigative journalism continues to be funded. But at the moment, there's no immediate threat to those particular people in that particular company.